Good evening, students. My name is Mr. Westbrook, and I will be guiding you through a brief exploration of horror. As an emotion, what is horror? Well, the dictionary defines it as an overwhelming and painful feeling caused by something frightfully shocking, terrifying, or revolting. A shuddering fear. Also tends to be a fear that lingers with you, even if you're not thinking about it. But this leads into the question, what does that mean for horror as a genre? Well, the first core concept I want you all to keep in mind is intent. For if every story even remotely scary were considered horror, well, we'd have to count the Teletubbies in that as well, and despite their truly horrifying appearance, they were not intended to be horror. They were intended to be a cute, cuddly, funny mascot for a kids' show. The fact that the lunatic that designed them failed miserably at that goal does not make them horror, it just makes them unintentionally horrifying to look at. The Nosferatu-looking vampire over here, on the other hand, he was very much intended to scare you from the start, to make you fear running into him on a dark night. And along with intent, another core idea at the heart of any horror story is disempowerment. See, before I can explain that, first there is empowerment, which most other genres work towards. They try to make you and the main character feel more powerful, more able to do things by the end of the story, like you've gained something from it. That the characters are stronger for their experience, no matter how harrowing they were. Horror, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's where the protagonists are made to feel that they are helpless, powerless, vulnerable. By extension, you as well. As though both you and the protagonists have little control over their lives, if any. And horror is unique, and it is the only genre where the heroes, even if they do everything right, even if they succeed, they vanquish the bad guy, or whatever it is, they're still often not any better off for it. Either barely surviving, doomed after the fact, or just suffering any number of other ways. Now, there are a lot of perspectives on what horror is and how it functions. For example, Stephen King argues that we make up horror stories to help us cope with the real ones. And there's a fair bit of logic to it, because after all, sometimes horror does let the protagonist have a happy ending afterwards. It was just a very harrowing and horrifying trip through a nightmare. But the nightmare's over, and it's all dealt with. Sometimes horror is also simply therapeutic. It helps us understand our feelings better, or helps us feel like we belong, as Alice Cooper would say. Because after all, we all felt utterly alone sometimes. We've all felt a little mad sometimes, haven't we? Now, we're going to start on a lesson on Gothic horror in a second. But first, I wanted you to get a sense of the atmosphere that goes into Gothic horror very often. Because it's not quite something that can be described easily. It's something you have to experience.
Insolent boy, this slave of fashion, basking in your glory. Ignorant fool, this brave young suitor, sharing in my triumph.
I hear you speak, I listen, sigh by my side, guide me. Little my soul was weak, forgive me, enter at last, Master.
Flattering child, you shan't know me. See why in shadow I hide. Look at your face in the mirror. I am there inside. I am your angel of music. Come to me, angel of music.
Who's that voice? Who is that in there?
I am your angel of music. Come to me, angel of music.
And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the hypnotic atmosphere of true gothic horror. It pulls you in, lulls you a bit, makes you think you're just in for a nice, extravagant little romance, perhaps. And then it gets to you. It shows the monster for what it is. But is that all there is to it? As you can see, Gothic horror, well, you may have actually seen it before without realizing it. Ever see a ghost story, perhaps? Read about a vampire, perhaps Dracula, perhaps Lestat? Ever hear about werewolves? Zombies? All trace their roots back to Gothic horror. And in fact, one of the earliest works of Gothic horror, Frankenstein, or the new Prometheus, led directly into science fiction. Okay, the primary period in which Gothic horror was written was starting in the late 1700s to the mid-1800s, and the key authors were Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and Edgar Allan Poe. If you're wondering why I give him more credit, it's because Shelley and Stoker really only wrote a few novels in the genre, while Edgar Allan Poe wrote over 50 short stories, poems, and novels. And I like to assign grading based on who did most of the actual work. Not to say that Mary Shelley's contribution was insignificant, but far from it. But it was the only one. Anyway, she lived from 1797 to 1851. She was the daughter of a feminist philosopher, educator, and writer, Mary Wollstonecraft, who I believe wrote a number of parody romances, and philosopher, novelist, journalist William Godwin. If you're on the internet, I'm not sure if Godwin's law has anything to do with him, but there we are. She later married a famed writer, Percy Bysshe Shelley, in 1814. If you've seen Breaking Bad, you've probably heard his poem, Ozymandias. Most well known for Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, which was published in 1818. You know better as Frankenstein's monster. Well, little fact, the movies get it wrong. The monster is intelligent and extremely eloquent, to the point that despite his horrible deeds, you can easily sympathize with him. See him as the real victim, and the doctor as the true monster of the tale. And yet it also keeps going back and forth on that point. And this incredible, insightful story was the first draft ever written was as part of a private horror story writing contest between Mary, Percy, and their mutual friends, while they were all trapped in a remote mountain cabin due to an avalanche. And despite some issues with Bram Stoker, you may find out on your own, he also contributed heavily to Gothic horror with one novel. Dracula is incredibly influential. It is the most adapted vampire novel ever. And while the man himself lived between 1847 to 1912. As I said, he's best known for Dracula. He was more well known in his life as the personal assistant of a famous actor, Sir Henry Irving, however, and the business manager of the Lyceum Theatre. The main inspirations for Dracula, in addition to common folklore, included the Slane's Castle, the crypts at St. Macon's Church, and the novella Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. Read Carmilla when you're older, please. Finally, we have Edgar Allan Poe. He lived from 1809 to 1849. His father abandoned his family at a young age, and his mother died soon after from tuberculosis, which is a truly horrifying disease that makes you cough up blood and severely damages your lungs to the point of non-functionality. He was raised by his parents, John and Frances Allan. That's where the Allan in his name comes from. But despite all this, by age 13, he wrote enough poetry to fill an entire book if he wanted to. So he could get it published. It was that good, and he wrote that much of it. One thing to keep in mind with all of his work is that he struggled with depression his entire life. He did not have an easy life by any stretch. His wife died young, and he stopped writing after that. He was too devastated by her death, and he died 2 years later. Some argue that it was suicide, some argue it was something else, but given depression, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if it were the former. But by then, he had written over 50 works of Gothic fiction, including poetry, short stories, and novels. Such classics as The Raven, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Telltale Heart, many, many more. Now, back to Gothic horror as a genre. The core themes of Gothic horror are, 1, niggling question in the back of your mind. Who are the real monsters? Is it the animated corpse here? Is it the vampire? Is it the hunchback? Or is it us? Are we the real monsters? After all the monster wants is to live. He wants to exist. He wants to have a normal life as much as he can. But anyone who sees him wants to kill him. Vampires are forced to drain blood and kill to survive. Is that really their fault? And poor Quasimodo here. Taken in by a priest and abused. Constantly told he was less than he was, that he was a monster just for his appearance. And similarly, humanity versus science. Again, Frankenstein. The book Frankenstein was very much about Mary Shelley's anxieties about where science could take us, what horrifying vistas it could unveil if we allow it to continue unshackled by ethics. Though thankfully modern science is firmly held in check by ethics, morality. Third theme is humanity versus God or religion. And again, in the original version of Hunchback of Notre Dame, Frollo wasn't a judge, he was a priest. And a big theme of that story was the corruption of the church at the time, and how they were abusing their power. Now, some common elements of Gothic horror are supernatural threats that can appear human, vampires being an excellent example of that. The setting either being a character unto itself, or the setting as a metaphorical extension of a key character's state of mind. An excellent example of that concept would be Telltale Heart. Because was there really a heart under the floorboards beating? Or is that just another part of the crazy narrator's obsessions? And finally, high passions and higher pursuits, no matter how noble, often leading to dark obsessions that lead to the character's downfall. Now again, to really understand setting as character, this is something you have to kind of see. It's part of the atmosphere. Try to guess what the people in the story are like based on what you can see here.
A house as old as this one becomes, in time, a living thing. It may have timber for bones and windows for eyes. But sitting here all alone, it can go slowly mad. It starts holding on to things, keeping them alive when they shouldn't be. Inside its walls.
Alright. Based on what you just saw, we can safely say that the characters living in this house haven't been taking very good care of it, and that there is something very strange going on. Now, to move on, the dark obsessions and who the real monster is really plays into here, because I'm sure many of you are familiar with Batman. Now, how many of you know about his classic villain, Mr. Freeze? Did you know that he began as a scientist trying to help people? He was pioneering cryogenic freezing to save his wife by freezing her until a cure could be found for the terrible illness she had. Unfortunately, that cost money, and the company he was working for didn't like paying the bills for so long. So his boss tried to shut everything down, and when Mr. Freeze understandably resisted that, he ended up being shoved into a vat of chemicals, which does exactly what it does in superhero comics. It mutated him. Now, let's see how well he took it.
I'm beyond emotions. They've been frozen dead in me.
That suit you wear, a result of the coolant?
Very good. A detective to the last. I can no longer survive out of a sub-zero environment. Tonight I mean to pay back the man who ruined my life. Our lives.
Even if you have to kill everyone in the building to do it?
Think of it, Batman. To never again walk on a summer's day with a hot wind in your face and a warm hand to hold. Oh yes, I'd kill for that.
Yeah, so not very well. Again, can you really blame him? Especially since this same boss hasn't shown a single flicker of genuine remorse throughout the entire episode. And well, want to see what happens when Mr. Freeze gets his revenge?
I will finish this.
Apologies, ladies and gentlemen, the internet is not cooperating at present.
The cold eyes of vengeance are upon you, Boyle.
Who are you?
Come now. Surely you remember your old colleague, Victor Freeze.
No! No! Stop! Please. Beg you.
You beg? In my nightmares, I see my Nora behind the glass, begging to me with frozen eyes. How I've longed to see that look frozen on you.
And of course, Batman stops him and puts Mr. Freeze in jail. Though he also provides evidence of Mr. Boyle's misdeeds to the press. But still, see how his dark obsession led to him nearly killing a whole building full of people who had nothing to do with it? And how it led to him being imprisoned for life? Never let your obsessions get to you, folks. Alright, now, as we switch over to cosmic horror, I thought I'd read a more recent entry in that genre. I still get these nightmares. In fact, I get them so often, I should be used to them by now. I'm not! No one ever really gets used to nightmares. I'm so tired. Sleep's been stalking me for too long to remember. Inevitable, I suppose. Sadly, though, I'm not looking forward to the prospect. I say, sadly, because there was a time when I actually enjoyed sleeping. In fact, I slept all the time. That was before my friend Lude woke me up at 3 in the morning and asked me to come over to his place. Who knows? If I hadn't heard that phone ring, would everything be different now? I think about that a lot. Well, Lude was a good enough friend that I dragged myself out of bed and went over to his apartment, and he took me on a little tour of the empty apartment of a man who just died. Old man Zampano. And as we looked through it, I found it. Dead Old Man Zampano's manuscript. And as I discovered, there were reams and reams of it. Endless snarls of words, sometimes twisting into meaning, sometimes into nothing at all. Frequently breaking apart, always branching off into other pieces I'd come across later. On old napkins, the tattered edges of an envelope, once even on the back of a postage stamp. Everything and anything but empty. Each fragment completely covered with the creep of years and years of ink pronouncements. Layered, crossed out, amended, handwritten, tight, legible, illegible, bits crisp and clean, others faded, burnt, or folded and refolded so many times the creases have obliterated whole passages of God knows what. Sense? Truth? Deceit? A legacy of prophecy or lunacy or nothing of the kind? And in the end, achieving what? I just fixed myself some tea on the hot plate here. My stomach's gone. I can barely keep even this honey milked up stuff down. But I need the warmth. I'm in a hotel now. My studio's history. A lot these days is history. I haven't even washed the blood off yet. Not all of it's mine, either. Still caked around my fingers. Signs of it on my shirt. What's happened here? I keep asking myself. What have I done? Of course. I only have my own immeasurable stupidity to blame for winding up here. The old man left plenty of clues and warnings. I was the fool to ignore them. Or was it the reverse? Did I secretly enjoy them? At least I should have had some inkling what I was getting into when I read this note, written just one day before the old man died. January 5th, 1997. Whoever finds and publishes this work shall be entitled to all proceeds. I ask only that my name take its rightful place. Perhaps you'll even prosper. If, however, you discover that readers are less than sympathetic and choose to dismiss this enterprise out of hand, then may I suggest you celebrate and dance, for whether you know it or not, now you are truly prosperous. They say truth stands the test of time. I can think of no greater comfort than knowing this document failed such a test. With a little luck, you'll dismiss this labor, react as Zampano had hoped, call it needlessly complicated, pointlessly obtuse, prolix, your word, ridiculously conceived, and you'll believe all you've said, and then you'll put it aside. Well, even here, just that one word, aside, makes me shudder. For what is ever really just put aside? And you'll carry on, eat, drink, be merry, and most of all, you'll sleep well. Then again, there's a good chance you won't. This much I'm certain of. It doesn't happen immediately. You'll finish, and that will be that. Until a moment will come, maybe in a month, maybe in a year, maybe even several years. You'll be sick, or feeling troubled, or deeply in love, or quietly uncertain, or even content for the first time in your life. It won't matter. Out of the blue, beyond any cause you can trace, you'll suddenly realize things are not how you perceive them to be at all. For some reason, you will no longer be the person you believed you once were. You'll detect slow and subtle shifts going on all around you. More importantly, shifts in you. Worse, you realize it's always been shifting. Like a shimmer of sorts. A vast shimmer. only dark, like a room. But you won't understand why or how. You've forgotten what granted you this awareness in the first place. Old shelters, television, magazines, movies won't protect you anymore. You might try scribbling in a journal, on a napkin, maybe even the margins of this book. And that's when you'll discover you no longer trust the very walls you always took for granted. Even the hallways you've walked 100 times will feel longer, much longer, and the shadows, any shadow at all, will suddenly seem deeper, much, much deeper. You might try then, as I did, to find a sky so full of stars it will blind you again. Only, no sky can blind you now, even with all that iridescent magic up there. Your eye will no longer trace the light. It will no longer trace constellations. You'll care only about the darkness, and you'll watch it for hours, for days, maybe even for years, trying in vain to believe you're some kind of indispensable, universe-appointed sentinel. As if, just by looking, you could actually keep it all at bay. It'll get so bad, you'll be afraid to look away. You'll be afraid to sleep. Then, no matter where you are, in a crowded restaurant, or on some desolate street, or even in the comforts of your own home, you'll watch yourself dismantle every assurance you ever lived by. You'll stand aside as a great complexity intrudes, tearing apart, piece by piece, all of your carefully conceived denials, whether deliberate or unconscious. And then, for better or worse, you'll turn, unable to resist, though try to resist you still will, fighting with everything you've got, not to face the thing you most dread, what is now, what will be, what has always come before, the creature you truly are, the creature we all are, buried in the nameless black of a name. And then the nightmares will begin. Johnny Truant, October 31st, 1998, Hollywood, California. Yes, well, I hope that gives you some sense of what to expect from cosmic horror. And as its founder, H.P. Lovecraft, said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Now, cosmic horror truly did begin as the work of one man, H.P. Lovecraft, who lived from 1890 to 1937. His father died from syphilis, which is a horrifying disease that makes parts of your body rot off and slowly drives you mad. Now, his father died from syphilis when little Howie was very young, and afterwards he ended up developing a very impersonal and simultaneously overbearing relationship with his mother. She wouldn't let him leave the house a lot of the time for any reason, and she was just very controlling over his life, which had a very profound effect on him. As such, he was often ill and reclusive as a child. He also read a lot. And he ultimately had a nervous breakdown in high school, which took him out of the public life for a long time. Now, some core themes of cosmic horror. 1, humanity is utterly insignificant. 2, the universe is cold, indifferent, and incomprehensible. And 3, of course, madness. See, in Howard Phillips Lovecraft's time, we were just beginning to understand the universe and how big it really was. And in the face of that, see that tiny dot over here? Don't we seem so much more insignificant over here compared to everything else out here? Whereas before, humanity had always assumed it was the center of everything, the most important, the most intelligent species out there. But what if we weren't? Wouldn't that make you hopeless and insignificant? Strives at the real emotional core of cosmic horror, which is that feeling of utter powerlessness before something much bigger than you, something much more powerful and ancient that does not care about you in the slightest. Well, haven't we all faced something like that? Some authority figure like that, government, perhaps, an overbearing parent, over-controlling authority figure that's keeping you down in some way, or this feeling like the economics of the times, or the weather, or the way things are going overall is just too much for you to deal with. That's what this brand of horror is all about. Some common elements of this genre are, 1, the protagonist is often a detective or an academic of some kind, like an archaeologist or a theoretical physicist or something like that. Creepy, obscure towns appear a lot here. They also sometimes appeared in other kinds of horror like Gothic and Supernatural, but they're very prominent here because the idea is that these towns are isolated completely. And they've evolved their own society in strange ways that make little to no sense to everyone else. Number 3, cults tend to pop up. They tend to perform all manner of horrifying rituals in service to alien gods that don't care. These strange gods are too powerful and too ancient to care in the slightest for their worship for any human, even their worshippers. To them, it's like if your chicken dinner was suddenly trying to appease you. Would that work? Finally, eldritch artifacts like ancient books or strange technology shows up a lot, which we'll discuss more in a moment. Now, as for influences, well, this little guy here is a night gaunt, one of Lovecraft's creations. Look familiar. And also, Godzilla is in the original movie was a rampaging monster that was completely unstoppable. Everything the military threw at it did nothing. The movie only ended because Godzilla got bored and went back to sleep on his own. However, I could also just as easily be describing Cthulhu here, because he is also famous for taking long naps and then waking up to cause chaos. And both of them are as unstoppable as the Slender Man of internet fame. Now for a little modern example.
Always use a turn signal. Park between the lines. Yes! Drop off dry cleaning before noon. Read the headlines. Don't forget to smile. Always root for the local sports team.
Go sports team!
Always return a compliment. Hey, you look nice.
So do you.
Drink overpriced coffee.
Here you go. That's $37.
Awesome!
Everything is awesome.
Did you?
But is everything really so awesome in Lego Town, or whatever they call it? And yes, I am being serious here. Yes, that Lego movie has some Lovecraftian influences, whether they know it or not. You see, early on, we're introduced to this device, the Craggle. Now, we know it's crazy glue, but do the Lego people know that? I don't think so. To them, it's a strange, eldritch artifact that they can't possibly hope to comprehend fully. But we know it's crazy glue. And in the end, after following our intrepid heroes through comedic adventures that are incredibly memorable, what happens? How are the Lego people saved from being glued to the floor? They're saved by a conversation between a boy and his dad. And did Emmett, the hero, have anything to do with that? No. You didn't even see it happen. Nothing the Lego characters did mattered. Nothing the heroes did mattered. Nothing Lord Business here mattered. And Emmett was the only one who was aware of these creatures who were really controlling their lives. These giant, incomprehensible beings. That the only reason he doesn't go mad from it is he's not exactly smart enough to think the implications of this through enough. And finally, both Gothic horror and cosmic horror led into a more modern genre known as psychological horror. Because while both cosmic horror and Gothic horror dealt with madness in some way, it was generally in that kind of obsessive, with Gothic horror is that obsessive, I must do this, and hang the consequences kind of way. Whereas in cosmic horror, it was in the, I'm going mad from finding out the secret thing, Where in psychological horror, this is all about the horrors of your own mind. Psychological horror takes facts that we have uncovered about the human psyche and uses them to fuel its horror. Or put succinctly, what's real or isn't doesn't matter here. The consequences are the same. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Good night.